I'm sorry.
It says
Boardrooms host.
boardroom.
Can you guys record? Can you guys find the
It
record button there?
Yeah, I think I
It
started it.
actually looks like it's
It's
Malcolm.
recording.
It is recording.
It is.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. Today's session is going to be on project management. I think we're going to do a few sessions on project management, and we'll cover all of the areas in project management, but I wanted to start with contracts and risk management because it's a pertinent topic we've had. I mean, this year's been a great year at Avero, but we've also had some contract terminations and issues. Most of them not our fault, but there are things we could have done to mitigate the um, outcomes that it led to. So I want to talk about that. And guys, feel free to jump in. Robert, Steve, whoever's on this call, to talk about specific examples. And do's and don'ts. And obviously, let's keep this interactive so we can um, keep it fun. So I'm going to try and share my screen, put a quick slideshow together. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Awesome. So let's talk about contract scope, um, legal stuff, risks. How do you spot risks? How do you avoid them? How do you mitigate them when you see them? And the key point here is as we execute on projects, and our values and the way we do work is that we are in it with the client. We say that in our marketing, we say that in our sales presentations, but sometimes when the client does not have the same attitude towards us, it can lead to trouble, right? We can go from being helpers and doing small favors and doing things off the book for the client can lead to massive risk on the legal side, on the contract side. And a lot of times, um, people change, people take different jobs, new people come into the same organization, and that can be a huge issue. And these things aren't necessarily talked about in the PMI framework. PMI framework will talk to you about how to manage risk and contracts and risk registers and stuff. Um, this is related, but it's a very human thing, especially the way we deliver our projects where again, we're saying we're in it with you, we're part of the organization, you can come to us with anything. Yes, but there is always risk associated. So how do we deal with that while keeping that same attitude towards project delivery and our clients is what we should talk about today. So what we'll learn about is how do you spot the signals? How do you keep your risk management antennas up to see, okay, what is an innocuous request? And even if it is, what can it lead to down the road in terms of risk? Because our project sponsors are the CFOs, CIOs, CEOs, executive directors, but the day-to-day execution of the project happens at the lower levels, where your business analysts or directors or managers of the organization on the client side don't necessarily understand the risk that a supposedly small request might pose or a small um, slippage in timeline or something additional they're asking for. So paying attention to those signals is extremely important. We need to learn to say yes and, right? Because contracts are not walls. They're not boxes we need to stay in. And we've seen how this can be taken too far with some of our vendor relationships where the vendor says, no, I can't talk to you at 3 p.m. on Wednesdays because our contract doesn't say that. That is extreme. But how do you spot opportunity when you feel like, or you sense, or you identify that there is scope creep? It can also lead to opportunity. If client is asking for something that is not in scope, or it's somewhat in scope, but not completely, is that an opportunity? So that's where the yes and strategy comes in that can turn scope creep into opportunity. And then we'll talk about the do's and don'ts, like I said. What do you do in certain situations? And really, there isn't necessarily a playbook or an SOP on this. It's just a matter of honing your gut instincts and making sure that you're not putting the organization, our organization or theirs, at risk just because you didn't pay attention to something or you were trying to be helpful, you know? So we need to shift our mindset. And I'll talk to you about a few examples as we go on. The helper trap. Like I said, we're wired to be helpful. We sell ourselves as being in it with you, and we'll be there in bad times and good times for the client. But these are high stake contracts. The clients are spending anywhere from 10 to $50 million on software, and they're putting us responsible to watch their backs, to act on their behalves, to make sure that we're managing the risks for them. But within that is a huge risk profile for us. So we need to be cognizant of those facts and make sure that in these situations we understand all of the moving parts as project managers, as consultants, as BAs. We're always on the lookout for what does something mean for us and the client, because in many situations we're dealing with the vendor, we're dealing with an SI, we're dealing with our client, we're dealing with our own staff. A big part of project management is identifying and managing risks and communicating those risks. We need to say documentation first. Again, this can be taken too far, right? This is where good judgment comes into play. How do you protect ourselves while giving the client what they want, while communicating the risk to them, to internally to our management, to your teams, and saying, yes, we can do that, but let's document it. This might lead to a change order. And remember, change orders don't always have to be related to money. They can always be no cost change orders. But the point is that you document everything if there is a change in scope and what the client expects us to do compared to what's in our contract. You need to document it first. Then you need to communicate and then come up with a plan for how you're going to address that. And then again, contract terms. Contracts can be really dry and boring, but it's really important that everybody on the team understands contracts. It's not just the director's job to understand contracts. Everyone on the team needs to read a contract when we first get a project. Project managers, analysts, directors, VPs, everybody. Because terms and conditions matter, scope matters, things that the client is paying us for is all written down in a contract and it matters. So paying attention to what's in our contract is really, really important, right? And again, it's not to say that we build walls around us. We say no to everything that's not in scope. Keep in mind, out of scope stuff can often lead to follow-ons, change orders, and more revenue for us. But that doesn't happen if you don't know what's in our contract, what's in scope. So what does a smart consultant do? And when I say consultant, it applies to all levels, right? Documenting everything is number one. Documentation creates trust, and it starts with taking notes in a meeting. Never go into a meeting without a notebook. It's my rule number one. Now, you guys may use uh, laptops or other devices, but note taking is a critical thing that you do. Even if you're recording a meeting, even if you're typing it into a computer, the act of you taking down what someone else is saying shows that you're a professional, shows that you're paying attention, shows that you will take action on the things you're talking about. So documentation is key. That's the basic level. Then documenting everything, meaning meeting minutes, meeting notes, um, email, sometimes a conversation held in a hallway somewhere that leads to decisions needs to be documented. It can be documented in an email saying, "Hey, great running into you. Here's what we talked about and next steps." Quick, simple, easy. That keeps a record of what was discussed, what was said, what was decided, if anything. Uh, Turning requests into revenue opportunities. Again, a big part of a successful consulting company is how well do you keep the work coming from the same client. And it doesn't happen formally, right? The follow-ons come out of small requests. They come out of small things we notice that weren't in scope, should be in scope, that's going to help the client eventually. That needs to be documented, communicated up within the company, and then we can turn those requests into revenue opportunities. But it all comes down to keeping an eye on what's in scope, what's not, and documenting it. Maintaining professional boundaries while staying helpful. Again, we can run into the trap of being extremely helpful in the spirit of partnership when the client isn't feeling the same way, right? There are clients out there that will take advantage of that. And we've all run into that, right? So there's a fine line between being extremely helpful and being very professional. And it comes down to documentation. It really comes down to understanding what we signed up for, what's professional, what's not, what's being asked of us, and where the risks lie. And then the yes and strategy, right? Again, if something is out of line, out of scope, we don't say no. We say yes and or yes but, and steer the conversation towards the contract scope. And remember, talking about scope, talking about change orders, change requests is not, these are not bad words. These are risk management frameworks. These are professional words and terms that are enshrined in our contract. They're enshrined in frameworks like the PMI framework. So it's a professional tool that we need to use to manage these relationships and projects. And then systematic processes for scope management. Again, some of these are laid out in our contract, sometimes they're not, probably should be in our proposals. What happens when there is a request for something that is outside of scope, or when we identify something that needs to be done that's not in scope? The process of how we handle that should be clearly defined in a contract. And so, as good consultants, project managers, we need to always keep that in mind, meaning when a change request comes to you, or a request comes to you that's outside of scope, what is the process to follow? And then viewing contract execution as a competitive advantage, right? Finishing a contract, getting it signed, doing it well within scope, within budget, hitting all of the scope items, doing it well is what builds reputation. It's what builds the confidence in a client to call their friends in the next county and say, hey, these guys are great. They did the project within scope. When there were issues, they handled it efficiently and professionally, and we had no surprises. So doing it well is a competitive advantage. So what makes consultants, and again, when I say consultants, this is general, consulting companies and groups and firms and teams fail at scope management. Number one is fear of damaging client relationships. Again, if you go at contract and risk management as something that is a no-no and a taboo, and it's not something we should be talking about because the client might get mad at us, that is unprofessionalism on both ends, right? If a client is a professional on the other side, they understand that things change, new information emerges, that the project you scoped 2 years ago and then spent 2 more years putting an RFP out for, the world has changed. So making sure the client understands that you're making them understand that scope management, talking about the contract, milestones, terms and conditions is not adversarial. It's actually protecting both sides. So don't fear damaging client relationships. If it's a good relationship, a client understands that these are things that are in our scope to manage. Contract management is a big part of what we do. Second is lack of documentation and processes, right? You forget to document something, you get verbal approvals. You don't send a PSR 1 week or 2 weeks in a row. Huge risks because that's the document we use to tell our clients, here's what we're done, here's what's coming up, here are the risks, here's where the budget stands. And I personally have been bit many times in my project management days when I skipped 1 week of a PSR, and that was the week that brought everything down. So these are critical things. And the PSR is just one thing, right? Documentation lives in emails, in texts, uh, again, hallway communications, everything needs to be documented in the best format possible, right? Don't go nuts about creating a two-page document over a 10-minute conversation unless required, but use your best judgment. When there are no clear protocols for handling change requests, this is a risk. This is where things fail too. When a client asks for something and we, either say no or hem and haw or, come back and we don't have a proper channel for how do you make these requests work because you can't just say yes and do the thing because it takes you away from the original scope, the budget, the timelines, and that leads to change in quality. So having clear protocols on every project for how you handle change is really important. Reactive management to contract approach to contract management. Contracts are in place to protect both parties, right? So when we do contracts, we make sure that the terms and conditions are protecting both sides and not just one. And as managers, we have to really be cognizant of what's in that contract. And we can't wait for something to fall apart to then lean on the contract. It's too late. So making sure we understand what our guardrails are, what our remedies are before we ever go into contract disputes. Because when you go into a contract dispute, when a client says, hey, page so and so on the contract says this and you're not doing it, it's too late. You don't want them to go there, which means that we have to make sure we understand what's in our contract and proactively manage the projects to those. So what do we need for execution intelligence, as I put it? Like, how do we do the work, the scope of work? How do we deliver projects while keeping us risk-free as much as possible? So what you need is strong communication skills, negotiation skills required, right? And it's not, when you talk about negotiations, it happens in small things, happens over small things. It doesn't have to be a major contract point you're negotiating over 10 days. Contract negotiations can happen again in the hallway. Uh, so you need strong communication skills to let the client know and your team know that this is a contract issue or out of scope issue. And so you need communication skills. Savvy clients will push you. Uh, they will, because, if there's a contract element that is kind of fuzzy, savvy, smart clients will take advantage of that. So you have to be able to communicate and negotiate what the intent of that clause was or how it's supposed to go and not keep it fuzzy. Understanding of contract language and legal implications. Again, you don't have to be a lawyer, but you have to understand what these things mean. And most contracts are pretty simple, right? They talk about who's doing what. Here's the scope of work. Here's how we're going to get paid. What causes termination, and so on and so forth. Indemnity, insurance, money involved. So understanding a contract is not that difficult. And you don't have to be a lawyer. You just have to understand what it means in terms of your scope of work and what you're supposed to be delivering. And the ability to translate technical work into business value. This is critical because we've all seen contracts where the purchasing department doesn't understand what IT is asking for, and so it's getting shoved into the contract because they don't really understand it. We need to be able to translate that for a layperson and make sure that it's showing up in the contract um, in the way it should without any confusion. What you don't need is legal expertise. We have lawyers, um, on call that help us with legal language, with legal disputes. We don't expect our teammates to be lawyers or have legal expertise. We just need to focus on execution, documentation, and communication, not contract law. I hope I'm clear on the distinction, right? The ability to understand scope is most important. The terms and conditions in our contract, not law. Any questions? Clarifications, anybody? Steve, Robert, jump in.
I have one question, Avi.
Yeah.
Could you give an example, or is there a time when we would want to have that contract legally reviewed before sending it off?
Yeah. So when we get a new deal, for example, there's two ways this goes. Either they ask us for our boilerplate contract or they'll send us theirs. And when it's ours has been vetted by our legal counsel. Like it's a boilerplate. We don't need to do it for every occasion. Um, when a client sends us theirs, it's typically pretty standard, straightforward. Like we got Go Triangle 2 days ago, right? And it was straightforward except for a few elements. One was they wanted us to be SOC 2 compliant, but they were assuming, or their boilerplate assumed that we would be hosting their system, which isn't the case. So we pushed back on that and said that doesn't apply. Can we change it? They agreed. The other thing was milestones versus time and material payments. We're working on a resolution on that. So if it's simple stuff like that, we don't need to get legal involved because most of the other T's and C's are the same. If there's something weird in there that we can get the client to explain or change, then yes, we'll get our lawyers involved.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let's walk through some do's and don'ts. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list. Um, the quick review request, right? When a client says, "Hey, can you just quickly review this for me on this other project that we're doing that you guys are not involved in?" What does that tell you? It's clearly out of scope, but is a chance to peek into something else. I mean, it doesn't matter so much on smaller accounts, but large clients like, Port of Portland, Monroe, if someone's giving you a window into a project you're not involved in, to me, it's an opportunity. But also, if you're on the ground, you're supposed to be working on this selection project and you have to take 30 minutes out of your time to review something that's unrelated, uh, use your best judgment, right? It could be you for no reason should you be saying approving any deliverable for a client that is not related to yours. And think about the risk that can pose if you start putting your fingers in something you shouldn't be in. Um, the silent client, no communication is always scary. No news is not good news, right? So if a client is silent when they've been active and participative throughout the project, should put your antennas up. What's going on that you don't know? And this is, it's even worse when you're like most of our work is remote. Some of our staff are at client sites infrequently. Um, some, like in Portland, are there almost every day. So it's easier to sort of get the sense of what's going on. But silent client should make you um, alert on what might be going on. The third is the informal approval. When a client says just to, hey, let's save time on this, we're not going to sign off. Um, just take my word that is approved. Uh, not a good thing. You need to at least get it in an email. Verbal is not okay. Um, we've talked about $0 change strategy, documentation, client relationship management, revenue conversion. I use Gamma, so it made up a lot of stuff. I don't know what it's talking about. But again, the scenario methodology, quick review is out of scope. How do you handle out of scope requests? We talked about it. Document, talk to your team, see what you need to do about that. Because again, that quick review can lead to a lot more work on some other project that may not be related to yours. On a silent client, communication is key. Proactive communication. You may not be getting anything back, but you should be sending project status requests, and if it needs to be escalated, you need to do that if you're not hearing back from a client. And then the informal approval, again, documentation without formal meetings is not okay. So or informal, just verbal communications, approvals, feedback is not cool. So even if the client is telling you something verbally, you need to always document this.
Yeah, also be aware of the passive approval too, which we'll see with savvy clients. You show them the budget and they don't say anything, does not mean
Mhm.
that they're okay with the budget.
Yeah. So what do you do in these scenarios, right? And there's many different scenarios the way this plays out. Um, with any request from a client, the first thing you can do that's in your control for risk management is respond, acknowledge. Um, don't ignore. Don't wait till someone else gives you an okay to respond to it. The easy thing to do is say, received, I'll get back to you. Something to tell the client we're on it. Um, we've talked about no news is not good news. You need to be sending the client communications yourself and never skip documentation. It's kind of repetitive. So how do we turn risk into revenue when you're getting requests for out of scope stuff? What is the toolkit? What's the mindset you need? Uh, First, lean on your team, right? Depending on who it is that is being requested something. Might be a junior analyst or a consultant or a PM or a senior PM, whoever it is, you need to understand the impact. You can understand the impact when you know what the scope, the budget, the timeline, and the contract is. And then working with your team, you need to say yes and, or yes or, yes but. We can do it, but here's the impact. Here's what it's going to do to the timeline, to the budget, to the quality of the work. And sometimes, again, it may not be a dollar change order, but the word change order is not bad in itself. It could just be a quick email saying, here's what we're changing, or it can be a formal document saying, here's the change, here's the impact, here's the dollar impact, if any. Um, and so just keeping an eye on opportunity through change requests is really critical. So what are the realities? Why are we talking about this today? One is, like I said, when we are remote, when we're not in the same building with our clients, it increases the risk. When there's vacuum, something else fills that gap, right? When your client is wondering what's going on, uh, something else is going to fill the gap, and that could be a change in perception. Uh, Digital communication creates permanent records, which is a good and a bad thing. So in this case, it is a good thing. We're talking about risk management, contract vigilance, and remediation. Sending a quick email, a quick text, documented something or the other is your friend. It's going to protect you more often than not. And clients expect faster response times now. One of the examples I'll talk about later is a client that, we got one of these termination notices from, and their only gripe was you guys didn't respond, which, is not necessarily accurate, but that is what's in the termination letter. So clients expect faster response. Even if they don't expect it, it shows a lot of professionalism. I don't expect us to all be glued to our emails all the time, but once you see it, doesn't take much to just say, got it. Thank you. We'll review, get back to you. It's all it takes. And we are in a very competitive space, so it takes differentiation. But before you get to differentiation, you need to learn how to do the basics right, right? Doing all of the basics right at the same time at the highest capabilities, at the highest quality is what really differentiates us. And part of that is effective risk management, documentation, communication. And legal compliance is very, very important. Compliance, understanding contracts, what to do when a new request comes your way or the client's demanding something that is not in scope. Understanding that and how to deal with it is critically important. Because again, once you start talking contracts, once you get a letter saying you're in breach, it's probably too late. So let's talk about real examples. Um, Washoe County School District has been a client for over 2 years, and we helped them through the pre-selection, the RFP, the selection process. We helped them negotiate a contract. They chose a company called AST that was implementing Oracle. About 3 months into that project, AST started telling the client that what they promised in their contract is not something that they can do. By the way, here's our invoices. Um, and the fuzzy part of that is that their milestones were broken down into kickoff meeting, discovery sessions, blah, blah, blah. So they did all of that, and it came down to contract, some kind of data migration request that the client had, and the vendor said, no, that's not what we meant. And now here's a dispute. And we are the project managers. So we're supposed to be documenting everything, reporting back. We're supposed to be keeping the vendor on track for delivering on the scope. And we did all of that, right? And despite all of that, the client decided to cut ties with AST, the system implementer. We helped them negotiate out of that contract, or at least tried to. And then 2 weeks ago, from today, 2 weeks ago, we got a letter from the client, Washoe County School District, saying, you guys are the reason why we had to terminate AST's contract, and you guys are the reason we paid AST $1.2 million, and therefore you're in breach. Now, that's when we engaged our lawyers, and they're like, okay, well, did you guys do this, this, and this in the contract? Did you not do the things that they're saying? So that's when we went through the contract, and the lawyer was like, yeah, this doesn't say you guys are responsible for approving payments to ASD. And the story really that I don't know if we documented is that these decisions to pay the vendor were made despite our best advice by the client. Um, right, Robert? I mean, we were saying in meetings, don't pay them, they haven't done these things. But when the vendor sent their invoices, instead of us saying, don't pay them in an email, and I don't know, Patrick, are you on? He's not.
He's
Okay.
off today.
Okay.
Yeah, I can speak to it quickly.
Yeah.
The biggest thing in reading the letter that stood out is the fact that even though the CFO, Mark Mathers, was really unhappy with AST and came out of meetings where he was literally yelling at them, the next day he would approve the invoice for payment. I mean, that's hard. We can't step in and say, no, don't pay this. That was a choice that he made. So in a lot of ways, he negated his own argument as to what our oversight did or did not provide in his mind.
Well, we could have put that in writing, right? In meetings when we were saying, don't pay, not a good idea, and they would pay, our defense would have been, hey, don't, to reiterate, we recommend not paying this. Or after the fact, saw that you paid this, shouldn't have done that. Whatever. We're in the clear, but it's these small things, it's the nuances, right? We are not the gatekeepers of the payment, but we're supposed to be giving them advice on yes or no, and which we did. The only thing we didn't do is document it. Maybe we did. I don't, I haven't seen the whole thing, but the story as it stands is that they're claiming that we are in default because we didn't do that one thing. We did a 99 other things, right? That one thing is the reason for supposed default, but we're pushing back and saying, no, that's not the case. So we're clear. The next lesson is the Fort Worth housing solutions. Again, another termination that happened this year. And the way that went is, again, a 2 year and a half, 2 year plus engagement with the client, loves us through the whole thing. We did the pre-implementation work, the contract negotiations for the vendor. And, you know, early on, the client had said, hey, there's a lot more money here. Just keep going. We'll find more money towards, when we know what vendor we're choosing, how are we going to do this, how much data we're going to bring forward, which properties, blah, blah, blah. None of that turned out to be true. And our failure there was relying on a single point of contact, the VP, the CFO, right? Which is, again, bizarre because who else are you going to go to when the CFO is telling you everything's good, uh, love you guys, project's going well. And this is where earlier this year, the silent client shows up, right? Hector stops responding. He becomes unavailable. All of a sudden, he's too busy. And we weren't on site. Like what really I think happened is uh, there was leadership above Hector that wasn't happy with whatever he was doing. And that posed as a risk to us. So single point of failure on there. But again, going back to contracts and risk management, we're covered, right? We did everything that's in the contract. There's no way that uh, we can be held accountable for anything that goes wrong on that account. We did our job. Now, the two distinctive differences between these two um, situations. Washoe County is saying we're in breach because we didn't do something, which means they're saying they're terminating the contract for default. And in every contract that's written well, you should have the distinction between default and convenience. Default means you guys did something wrong, therefore we're done with you. Convenience means changed our mind, lost funding, project's no longer as important, we're going to cut it short. That's convenience. And the way the two different terminations are treated is really important. In default, they can claw back the money. They can ask us for all the money back or whatever money they lost on AST, they could go after us for that. For convenience means they owe us money for what we did or potentially for the remainder of the scope, right? Two different things. One is better than the other. No terminations are good anyway. So, uh, bottom line is we're covered in both instances, but despite of that, that's where we are, right? Because if we didn't have the documentation for Washoe County, yes, we were in serious trouble because we couldn't prove otherwise. We would have to go with their uh, allegations, but we're covered. In Fort Worth, they're terminating for convenience, but we know what the situation is. And then the third one is the Fair Oaks Ranch situation, where um, we talked about this on the last session, where we relied on again a single point of failure. The CIO was the main point of contact who approved all of our deliverables, all of our invoices, until at the very end, his boss, the city manager, gets involved and says, "That's not what I was looking for." This is 8 to 9 months after the contract started, where they're saying this is not the scope that we agreed on. Fair. So they sent a termination letter that said you guys didn't do the scope right. We pushed back and say, no, we did it. You just weren't involved. So let's talk. And as it stands today, we fixed whatever report um, deficiencies that they saw, and that one will not lead to termination. I don't think so. That's a dynamic situation at this point. But three different examples of how things can go wrong on projects and how do you mitigate that, right? It all goes back to how do you know your contract, how well do you know your contract, your scope, and what tools do you have available to push back and mitigate. It all comes down to documentation, clear communication, and making sure that you're managing risk every day. Brian.
If it, can I add something to the Fort
Yeah,
Worth piece there?
please.
One of the things we learned when we went to transition that to do the turnover back into Fort Worth is during the project, Hector had made a verbal commitment to change some of the scope in our contract, right? So we had originally been scoped to manage a project plan. The third party that was doing the implementation, he wanted to move that project plan over to them, which is fundamentally a change in our scope. Doesn't sound like much, right? It doesn't sound like a whole lot of work. It's something you just say yes to, right? When we come down and we end up in these situations, that can be something as small as that can be a big problem, because if we hadn't documented that correctly and we weren't able to trace that back to a conversation with Hector and an email conversation, it is very easy for that to go the other direction where they say, no, you are in breach. We are doing this because your default, because you didn't hit this point of the scope. So during that meeting, they are complaining to us about us not managing the project plan. We can refer back to this documentation that we have saying, no, you asked for this change. You may not have agreed with Hector's decision. This is a decision your signing authority made. This is where we're good. So the importance of documentation cannot be overstated. Those hallway conversations, those phone conversations of, hey, I just want to do this. Let's make this change. Understanding what the scope in the contract says and understanding how that conversation affects that scope, I cannot understate how important that is to have it as a foundation.
Thanks, Steve. Brian, you had a question?
I was just going to add, thinking about the single point of failure, the scenarios you gave were about
Mm-hmm.
someone above the person who were used as a primary contact. But we're in a situation now. Port of Portland's project sponsor just announced port-wide their departure in a few weeks. So that's a case where you have a different, just pointing out to everyone, a different potential risk on single point of failure. That person could leave, someone else could come in place and have different expectations and want to look back at some of that documentation or how things were determined.
Yeah.
And the person that replaces her may have a different view, right? And if she has made changes that fundamentally change our contract, we have to have the documentation behind it to back up her decisions for the new person.
That happened with Washoe County School Districts very early on.
Yeah,
Having
good point.
deja vu right now.
It did. Yeah, good point, Clay. Thank you for reminding me, because that scope was kind of created by people that no longer were at the district when the project kicked off. But again, nothing fundamentally changed in the scope of work we were supposed to deliver. It's just what it means to the people now in charge is important to understand. Anybody else? All right, so what are the key takeaways? What do I want our team to keep in mind and think about is we're not helpers. People don't hire us to take notes. People don't hire us to simply just coordinate between 2 or 3 parties. We are consultants. We're professionals. And part of being a professional is using all the tools in our toolkit, including contracts, including change orders, to have those professional conversations to keep us out of risky situations. Two, documentation, documentation, documentation. Doesn't have to be reams of paper. Again, quick emails, text messages, if that's, the level you are on with some clients, um, and formal. Do not miss PSRs for any reason. They need to be an important tool in your risk management toolkit. And then every out of the scope, you create professional boundaries that are our protective shield, and it strengthens client relationship, right? Clients expect us to have those uh, items in our toolkit because guess what? Big consulting firms are competitors. That's what they use. They don't just rely on the relationship with a client, the friendship with a client, which can be a double-edged sword. So being professionals, setting professional boundaries, actually make the client relationship and your friendships better because now you're not confusing one for the other. Because and I say friendship because a lot of times we're working in such close proximity with our clients on life-altering projects for them and us that it's inevitable. We become close, we become friends. But at the end of the day, they're your client first and need to be treated as such. The only way you can do that and remain friends, which is because it's not a bad thing to create lifelong relationships with clients that can go somewhere else and become a client again. Documentation and setting professional boundaries is critical. And systematic execution. Systematic execution. This, again, project management 101. You need a project plan, you need a budget, you need a communication strategy, you need to stick to all of that. Timelines, budget, quality. Um, that is the very basis of how you create predictable business growth, how you're successful in your projects, and layer on top of that risk management strategies and contract vigilance. Open for questions, comments, discussions, more stories.
I have one more, AV.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about documentation, and that is the first good step. The other side that is definitely not as much fun is archiving, right? So all those situations that AV, those examples he gave, I had to go to the PMs and say, pull all your emails, which is a time-consuming, horrible, miserable event going through thousands of emails in Google to find what you need, right? So having a system to take that documentation that may not always be formalized, change reviews, change orders, having a system to organize it, stabilize it, and have it available is just as important as doing it in the first place, because it's great to do it in the first place, but if I can't get it in the moment that I ask for it, we have a problem, right? So do the change order, get it documented, get it pushed up line. If it's an email, put it somewhere where you know where it's easy to find. Because it can be, I feel bad for Patrick, the amount of emails he had to pull for Washoe County. I'll just put it that way.
But it was all there.
It was all there, but it was
Good work.
he spent some time doing it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a question about zero change orders and thinking about where there's contracts with less clarity than with others that may have pretty loosely defined terms. To what extent do we consider it using those zero change orders to document, the level of detail around it? What's the thought process in that approach?
There is not a one size fits all solution, Brian. That is where you take some best judgment and bring it up line, right? So you sit down with Carrie, Brian, myself, and say, hey, I believe this fundamentally changes the scope of our contract. And that's the term I want to become very familiar with, is fundamentally changing the scope. We need to do a change order, right? So I'll go back to Fort Worth. It fundamentally changed our scope to say that we were not managing a project plan. Probably should have had a change order. We're good that we have an email, but we should have had a change order because it changed the scope, right? When we go back in and look at something like Fair Oaks, where they just weren't happy with the way the ITSP was written, right? And the ITSP was our in scope was to create an ITSP. Kind of vague, kind of big, right? Changes into what that is don't necessarily need a change order, but get some sort of documentation to say that the CIO wanted this included in the ITSP, right? Get an email saying, hey, we talked about this in the hallway, just want to confirm it and push it back up. So it's a very fine line between what needs a change order and what doesn't. The default is go to a change order if the client relation allows it. Some folks don't want the burdensome needs of doing that, and we can manage that on one-offs. But think change order first, informal documentation through email, written somewhere second. Does that answer that question for you, Brian?
Yes.
I know there's a lot of potential sometimes with scope change where you're working on something and just through the course of natural development of the project, things kind of start going in a different direction where you kind of add on like, hey, we should do a little bit of this, we should kind of do some of this. And then suddenly months down the line, you kind of realize like, oh, hey, we're kind of outside the box here. What are some good kind of tips to just kind of do that little double check to make sure as you're going through a project to see if you're still within scope?
So I'm
Or
going to
are
give
there any recommendations for that?
there is, and I'm going to give you an analogy, right? In aviation, there's this term called CFIT, controlled flight in terrain. Normally happens at night with slowly rising terrain, where an aircraft is flying at a straight and level, and you don't realize that the ground's coming up to meet you, and all of a sudden you're a burning hole in the ground. It's exactly what you're talking about, right? That nice slow scope creep that eventually hits you, and you're a burning hole in the ground. The trick there is to get outside of what you're looking at and look around you, right? To maintain the awareness of the situation. How does that play into looking for scope creep? Is recognizing it early that you have terrain around you, right? That this is an incremental change in the scope. It isn't enough where I need a change order, but it's a little adjustment. Looking for the patterns that it's continuing to rise and heading it off before it hits there. So looking for, hey, this is going to impact the budget. Hey, all of a sudden I went from a 0.25 resource to a 0.5 resource on a project. That's a big it's a big highlight that something is changing fundamentally, right? That you need to put a stop to it and escalate it up. And you don't have to make these decisions in a vacuum. I want to be very clear.